What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and today we're going to learn how you can make Emacs start up faster. So probably you have been using Emacs long enough now and made enough of a configuration now that you've seen that over time Emacs just starts up slower and slower. And this is a pretty common issue because as you start to use more features in Emacs, you will eventually see that the more packages you add, the slower your startup gets. So what we're going to do today is use some tips and tricks to delay certain packages from loading at startup and also make the general startup process less, I guess, resource intensive so that your Emacs will start up a lot faster. Now, we did have another video where we talked about using the daemon mode of Emacs so that you can have a daemon running in the background and then you have individual Emacs windows that connect to that so that your startup appears to be faster. But this is a different approach entirely. It does not require using the daemon. This is going to be purely about making sure that your configuration is written the correct way so that the startup time is less than it was before. So let's see if there's any questions here. So we're recording this live as part of the Friday live stream, but you're probably watching this as a recording. So definitely feel free to leave any questions in the comments if we come across anything that you want to know more about. So let me jump over to the screen really quick. And the way that I'm going to do this is that we're going to jump into a Ubuntu 20 VM to try out this configuration. So we basically got the Emacs From Scratch configuration loaded up here. It's whatever the state of master is at the time that I am recording this video. So it's going to be what you see in the repo at that time. And we're going to take the existing configuration and we're going to make it start up a lot faster if we can. I've experimented with this a little bit. We'll see whether I'm actually able to make it start up a lot faster today. So I think we can. All right, so first of all, the question is, why is Emacs so slow to start up? Well, I guess really the second question is it really slow to start up or is it something else? So the way that we can find this out is to start Emacs using Emacs-Q. And what this is going to do is start Emacs without loading your configuration and just start a plain vanilla Emacs session. So if we jump over here to, well, by way of comparison, first, let's start Emacs right now. Let's just pay attention to how long this takes. So I'm going to click the icon for Emacs and it's starting, it's doing some stuff, and then finally it starts up. So that's probably like maybe 2 to 3 seconds. So it feels a little bit slow. So if we go into a terminal, and then we run Emacs-Q, then you'll see that basically it starts up instantly. So we know that Emacs inherently does not start up slowly. It starts up pretty quickly on its own. So obviously, it has something to do with our configuration. So what we're going to do now is progressively try to fix the slowness in our configuration so that we can make it a lot faster at startup. So one thing that we could do that will help us in this process is to actually see how long it's taking to start up Emacs. And the way that we can do this is to use the Emacs startup hook, basically. We can hook in a function to that then prints out the amount of time it took to start Emacs. Now, there's a couple helpful variables that get loaded up in Emacs whenever we start it up. It is the before init time and after init time variables. And these variables are actually used for this purpose of judging how long it takes to start Emacs. In fact, there's also a built-in function that you can use to print out the number of seconds it took to start Emacs. So if I were to use the function called Emacs, I'm in the echo area if you can't see that, Emacs-init-time function, it will tell me that my current Emacs session took basically 4 seconds to start up, 3.943, whatever. So you can run that function to get that amount of time anytime you want in your Emacs session, and that's because the Emacs startup process will set these two variables, and this function basically just prints out the difference between them. But we're going to make our own piece of configuration for that so that we get to see this information every time that we start up Emacs, and that's going to be really helpful for us to use that as a basis for progressively trying to fix the startup time issues. All right, so let's drop this over into our configuration file. I'm gonna load this up really quickly, emacs.d/emacs.org. So we're using our org mode based configuration. And I will put this in a section right after this tips for use called startup performance. And let me wrap this a little bit. So I try to use a fancy little stopwatch character inside of this string, but apparently Unicode fonts aren't rendering correctly, so I'm just going to take that out here. And so this is a function called EFS display startup time, and it just uses the message function to write out a message to say Emacs started in some certain amount of time, and also tells you how many garbage collections happen. We're not going to talk about garbage collection right now, but we will in a little bit so that you'll understand what that means. So we're formatting the amount of time it took, and we're calculating the amount of time that it took by using the time subtract. I can't speak today. Time subtract function to subtract the after init time from the before init time, so that we get to see that delta of time that happened between the initial part of the initialization and then the end of initialization. And then we use the GCS done variable to get the number of garbage collections. And now we're going to add this hook to the Emacs startup hook, so that whenever Emacs starts up, we will get this written out to the message buffer. So I will save this, and since it's tangled out our configuration to init.el, now we can restart Emacs to see what it tells us. So I'm going to click this Emacs icon. It's going to start up the startup process. And then finally, it will tell us Emacs loaded in 4.88 seconds. So that's probably because we're running this in a virtual machine, and it's on a machine that has streaming going on, a lot of other stuff happening at the same time. So definitely that makes it slower, but it's good because it gives us a starting point. We know that we can definitely improve on 4.88 seconds. All right, so just in case you want to know a little bit more about the startup process in Emacs and maybe like what happens in between that before init time and after init time, you can look at the source of the normal top level function. This is actually the function that controls the initialization process in Emacs. If I were to use Control H/F describe function to go to that, you can see that you can look at this. It tells us Emacs calls this function when it first starts up, okay? And then we can click on startup.el.gz and then go look at the code for this. And it's quite a long function, but you can see where Emacs startup hook gets invoked at some point. So if you really want to know what happens in Emacs startup, go take a look at the code for this function, and it will teach you a lot of things. Also, if you don't want to look at the code to understand the startup process, go look at this link for the Emacs Lisp manual, which will basically tell you the same thing, but in a numbered list so that you can actually understand what's going on. So that's another way to find out the information. All right, so the most important tip for increasing your Emacs startup time is just don't load any packages. Just use what's in Emacs, have that blinding white screen looking at you all day long, and just use what's already in box. In fact, there's quite a lot of things in box, so you might be able to come up with a pretty good configuration with the things that are only in box. I'm actually going to try to do some videos on that at some point in the future, because I think it's kind of an interesting idea to see how far you can go with what's already there. But today, we're going to just assume that you have a more quote-unquote modern configuration using use package, and we're going to use the features of use package to make your startup time shorter, because use package is kind of meant for this purpose, but a lot of times we don't set up our configuration correctly to make use of its benefits. So use package gives you a few different ways to defer package loading. So basically what that means is we want to make sure that during our initial init time, whenever before that, between the time where the before init time and after init time happen in that initial startup phase, we want to make sure that we're not loading packages that don't need to be loaded. And we have a few different things we can do with use package to make sure that is the case. So there is the hook parameter to use package, which basically allows you to hook a function that you've defined or that maybe already exists in Emacs to some hook that is defined by this package or some other package. Now, we've used this a lot already because it's pretty useful just for defining hook relationships. However, what you may not know is that if you define a hook using the hook syntax in use package, it actually will defer loading of your package until that hook actually fires. So if you've ever used hook before, you might not know this, but the package probably isn't getting loaded unless something else is causing it to be loaded early. So that's a pretty helpful thing to know. Similarly, when you use the bind option or even the bind key map option, if you use that for key bindings, it will actually set it up so that your package won't be loaded until you press one of those key bindings. So this is very handy because you're already going to use bind for setting up helpful key bindings, and it will just sort of automatically give you this behavior where you can get the package to be loaded at that time and not any time earlier. So that's very helpful. And there's also commands. So commands is basically a list of interactive commands that you might run yourself, like either through a key binding or maybe running it using MetaX. And it will wake up the package or load the package whenever you try to run one of those commands. Now, there's already a feature in Emacs Lisp called auto loads, which provides this, but I think that usePackage, what it ultimately does is automatically create auto loads for those commands for you if they don't already exist. So we'll talk about auto loads in another video in the Emacs Lisp series, but for now, let's just assume that commands is going to do us the favor of making sure that our package doesn't get loaded until we call one of those commands ourselves. Then there is the mode option, and this is an option that will allow you to say what the, like a pattern that you can use, a regular expression pattern you can use to match against the file that's being loaded to decide which mode to be started. This is very helpful for whenever you are trying to load modes for different programming languages or any type of file that has a specific file extension. You can use mode to basically say for .org files, load org mode, or for .js files, load js2 mode, or whatever you want to use for that. So this is very useful for those specific language modes that don't really have any other way to defer them to identify that. And it also gives you the benefit of making that configuration so that when you open that file, it automatically starts up that mode. So you're probably going to use that anyway. Then there is the after option. And this is very useful for the other packages that you install that are using behavior from other packages you use. So for instance, the Eval collection package is a package you would almost always want to install that gives you extra key bindings for a lot of different modes to use in addition to Eval mode. So you don't necessarily need Eval collection to be loaded until Eval mode gets loaded. So you can use the after option here to say, I want to load Eval collection after Eval mode. And we'll see that in a minute. And then finally, there is defer. And defer is the catch-all. So if none of these other options apply, like if you have a package you're loading that doesn't need any of these other things, no hooks, no key bindings, no commands, no nothing, defer will give you the ability to say, I just want to defer this package until at some point later. Don't load it until later. And the interesting thing about defer is that you can say, okay, I just want to defer it and it won't get loaded until maybe you try to use something. Or you can say defer it until some number of seconds after init finishes. So if it's something that you definitely want to be loaded at startup, but you don't necessarily need it like immediately at startup, you can use defer with some integer number like 2, 3, 4, whatever, to say I want it to load at that point later after initialization starts in the idle time of Emacs. So it will wait until you stop using Emacs for a second, and then it will let a certain amount of time pass, and then it will load the package. So this is like the last thing that you can use to make sure that the package does not get loaded immediately at startup. All right. So I think that is enough right now, but there are a few other options that usePackage provides, and you should go check out the README because there's some other things like magic file lines and stuff like that are useful, but the things that we've listed here are the most common ones that you're going to come across. So we're going to show how to use these today to speed up the Emacs from Scratch configuration. And really the strategy here is just to look at all of your usePackage expressions and try to see which ones really don't need to be loaded at startup. Like really kind of take a clear look at what you have in there and figure out what the really minimal core set of things that you absolutely need the moment Emacs starts. And then anything else, try to find a way to defer it to be loaded later. And if all else fails, or no, actually, the thing I want to say here is maybe there are some packages that must be loaded by default, but you want to use some of these other options as well. There is an option called demand, so demand T, and this is useful for things that that you'll set key bindings on or maybe hooks on, but they must be loaded at startup. You can use demand T to force those to be loaded. So probably you won't use this very often. Usually it will be used for completion frameworks. You can use it for like Ivy, etc. But I actually don't find the need for it in a lot of cases. All right, so enough talking. Let's actually try this out. And one thing I'm going to do before I jump into the code there is I'm going to copy over a new key binding that will make it easier for me to get back to the emacs.org file, so I don't have to keep using Control-X-F and like go navigate to the file path and everything. So I'll just set this up really quickly. A question was asked, is it possible or beneficial to have usePackage load a package that is not from ELPA or MELPA? Yes, absolutely. And I do that quite often because usePackage itself is so useful in how it makes it easy and convenient to set up certain bits of configuration that you absolutely want to use that for things that are even built into Emacs, like dired. I use use package to configure dired. So absolutely, you definitely want to use it for things that aren't even going to be installed from a package repository. All right, so I'm going to find my EFS leader keys, and I'm going to add another key binding into it really quickly. And let's make sure that this is not going to be bound wrong. I think that's right. Let me evaluate this, Control X, Control E. All right. So I'm setting up control space FDE, and that's going to open up our emacs.org file. So you'll probably see me hit that a lot when we keep restarting the file, or restarting Emacs. Okay, so we're going to go basically section by section through this and try to see which parts we want to defer loading for. So let me just scroll right down through this. We got our startup performance section we already looked at before. Nothing here is important. Package system setup. Now, this part we're not really going to mess with because this obviously needs to be loaded at startup. I think there's some other things you can do here, but I'm not going to bother with that today. I might look at that in the future. But for now, let's just assume that you want to make sure that use package and the package management system that you're using, like package.el or straight.el or whatever, is loaded at startup immediately, because you're going to need that for everything else that's in this file. All right, the first use package expression that we see is for no littering. Now, no littering is useful because, and we actually made a video about this, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks ago. It's useful because it will set up certain Emacs variables to move common files that will get created while using Emacs so that they don't clutter up your main Emacs configuration folder. Because this is configuring these variables, we put it very early in our init, and we don't want to defer it. We want to make sure that it gets loaded at startup so that they configure those variables the right way, and that the files that are created by Emacs will go to the right place. So we definitely don't want to defer that. So we're going to skip that one. Now we have this basic UI configuration, and this is all just calling things that are built into Emacs, so we don't really need to defer any of this. We want this stuff to run at startup. Setting up some hooks. We're also setting font faces. This is definitely necessary for your initial, like, landing into Emacs. You want to make sure your fonts are set correctly. There may be some tweaks you can do here to make sure that you set it a little bit later, but I would think it's probably better just to go ahead and try to set those at startup. So we're not going to defer those. All right, key binding configuration. So general.el. Now, general is used for all of our key bindings. It's not necessarily needed during init because we aren't going to be pressing any keys until Emacs finally starts up. However, it needs to be loaded whenever Emacs is ready for us to use, and there's really no hook for us to use to start this up. However, we could, let's see, we could actually put this after Eval so that it gets loaded after Eval mode. So this may not actually help our startup time, but we can just show this as an example. So after Eval, and we'll see if general breaks after doing this. And notice here that I'm using the word Eval, and this correlates to the use package expression name. I'm not putting a single quote character in front of it because it's not necessary. And the reason why is because use package is a macro, and the usual evaluation rules for symbols do not apply in some of the cases of things in use package, like using after. So we can leave the quote character off here. Then we have Eval mode. We definitely want Eval mode to be loaded whenever we first start up Emacs. We could set this so that it is delayed to like 0 seconds. So like right whenever init is finished, then it will get loaded. But I think that it's a little bit risky to do that. So I'm going to leave that off too. Let's just assume we want to have Eval mode to load at startup. If we want to try to like shave off a little bit more time, we can experiment to see whether this makes any difference. But I think that probably it's more risky than necessary. I also want to say that if you start deferring certain packages, you might find that certain things that worked before stop working, and you're going to have to do a little bit of experimentation to see why. So I would say it's better to not try to do everything at first. Just try to find very targeted improvements to make, and then try them and see whether your workflow gets affected by it, and then figure out the problems before you start moving on to doing a whole lot of other packages. All right, so Eval collection. Now, we've already set this up to be after Eval because I basically copied this out of my own config, I think, and we have it set up to be after Eval. So Eval collection will not be loaded until after Eval mode has already been loaded successfully. Let's see. Matthew Marquez says he finds that using the use package always defer eases the maintainability since there's basically only the theme and mode line packages to demand. That's actually a good point, and it could help you out a lot. So basically, you want to demand things that you know need to be loaded by default. So that could be a good pointer. So we might try that at the very end. Remind me if I don't do that, Matthew. Okay. So UI configuration, command log mode. Now, here's the first example we have of a package that does not need to be loaded until we try to invoke it, because command log mode is mainly used for our own benefit in these screencasts, etc. Oh, speaking of which, I installed KeyCast. Is that going to work? Maybe it's not loaded in this config right now. Anyway, oh no, it's not in this config. All right, I didn't put KeyCast here. Anyway, so command log mode. What we were going to do here is we're going to use commands. And I think we're going to use command log mode. So if I were to use metax command log, yeah, so command log mode. We're not going to bother loading command log mode until command log mode is run. Now, this may already be set up as a auto load in the command log mode package, so it may not be necessary, but just for our own safety or sense of security, I guess, we're going to put that there. All right, so use package for Doom themes. We definitely want the theme to be started whenever we start up Emacs, so we're not going to bother with that right now. All the icons, yeah, all the icons is necessary because if the mode line is going to show an icon, all the icons needs to be loaded or at least configured before we show the mode line. So we're going to leave all the icons the way it is right now. We're also going to leave Doom mode line the way it is because we want that configuration for the mode line to happen at startup. Let's see. Jafer says, what do you type if you want it to load after two other packages? That's a very good question. Let me go back to here. So let's say that we wanted Eval collection to load after Eval and general for some reason. We could just say Eval general inside of parentheses, basically to make this a list. So it's just Eval, after, and then a list, and then whatever names of packages you want to load after. All right, so let's just jump back to where we were. Jafer says he's also seen after any org eval for eval org. Yeah, so that's the any syntax is the one that basically says whichever one loads first, org mode or eval mode, load this one after it. So that is another thing that could be useful. I haven't really used it myself very much at all, though. Okay, which key? Which key is not necessary at the very beginning because it's only necessary if you start pressing a key binding. And then you want that which key pop-up. So like if you remember, if we press Control X, we get this helpful little thing at the bottom of the screen here that just has all of these key bindings. That comes from which key. So this doesn't necessarily need to be loaded at startup. So we could try to use defer here and see if that helps. Let's try to use defer 0 maybe and see if we can just get it to load right at startup and not immediately. Now, one thing that does matter here, I think, is this init section. I think init will be run automatically whenever this use package expression is evaluated. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm wrong here, but I believe if you ever use init, it's going to defeat any of the other things that you put in here. So we actually need to move this which key mode into the config section that only gets run whenever the package gets loaded. So let's switch that up really quick. And since we made a couple changes, let's just see if we've actually improved anything yet. So I'm going to close Emacs, and then I'm going to run it again. And I think it was 4.88 seconds that it started up before. So let's see now what startup is like. Okay, it's 4.99 seconds. So we will see a little bit of variance in that number because it's, the amount of CPU usage at the time that you start Emacs may affect that. So don't be surprised if sometimes it goes up rather than down. All right, so let's go to which key again. Now, oops, let's move on to Ivy. So Ivy, we definitely want it to be loaded by default because it's going to be the first thing that that we see whenever we use Control-X-F or like try to use switch to buffer or anything like that. So it does need to be loaded by default. However, as you can see here, we are using a bind expression. And as I was saying before, the package won't be loaded until you hit one of these key bindings. Well, since Ivy, in theory, is mainly going to be used through key bindings, this actually works fine because if it loads Ivy later, then at least you know that it's going to be ready whenever you try to use it for the first time. Now, I'm actually kind of curious. whether Ivy is being loaded by default whenever we start up. So one thing that it can be helpful to do while you're going through this process is to use message and to say Ivy got loaded, just to be able to tell if that package gets loaded. So we're putting it in the config section here so that it gets run whenever the package does get loaded. So I'll close Emacs, I'll run it again, and then we'll see when Ivy gets loaded. Okay, so apparently Ivy is definitely getting loaded during the init phase. We can see that if we go back to the messages buffer, Ivy got loaded, gets written out before Emacs loaded in 5.52 seconds. So something else is causing Ivy to be loaded by default during the init phase, and it's probably another package. This often happens where another package is loading and then it's running a function or doing something that's causing the package you're trying to defer to get loaded. So there's another thing to keep in mind. All right, so we're not going to worry too much about that just because we do want Ivy to be loaded at first, but we will run into an example of this again in a little bit, I think. All right, so Ivy rich, we definitely want to use after Ivy here because Ivy rich is just a thing that gives you better sort of like columns of information inside of your Ivy completions, and that doesn't need to be loaded until Ivy gets loaded. So let's definitely defer that until later. Council is a package full of commands that are useful with Ivy, and we are setting it up so that it gets used with bindings. So it may be the case that council doesn't get pulled up yet, so we can also put in a message, council loaded. I believe there's also some kind of variable you can set in use package to see when certain packages get loaded, so we could probably use that instead to diagnose this. I'll try to find that and then set it in a little while, but let's use this strategy for now. All right, so let's just try this out really quickly and see what happens. I'm just going to quickly restart Emacs and then see. Okay, so council is definitely getting loaded at the very beginning before init finishes. So something is causing council to be loaded too. All right, so now let's jump back down to where we were. Okay, so we're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to keep moving and see what else we can set. So Ivy prescient, we are loading that after council, which is correct. So we don't need to change anything here. Helpful is definitely something that does not need to be loaded by default because we only need that when we're going to call any of these commands like helpful callable, helpful variable, etc. So let me actually make sure that those are commands. Helpful callable. I think this is a command. All right, it's an interactive function. So what we're going to do is we're going to use commands here, and we're going to use a list to say helpful callable. This may already be happening with auto loads. I'm not sure. So we're just going to do this anyway. Helpful variable, and then helpful command, and helpful key. And we will set that like that. Let's keep moving just to save some time. Hydra, we can definitely defer T, because we don't really need this to be loaded at start time. Let's see. And org mode. All right, so let's try all this before we start messing with org mode. So I'm gonna close Emacs. I'm gonna run it one more time, and let's see what it does. Okay, still 5.44 seconds. So really not much improvement so far. Usually what happens is that the really big packages are the ones that are gonna make the biggest difference for you. A lot of smaller packages like helpful, etc., either they've got their things set up correctly and there's not much surface area in the package to have a problem, or just there's not that much Emacs Lisp code to be loaded, so you don't really have a problem with it. So what we're gonna do is try to make a bigger package load later. So now we are looking at the org package. So we've got a hook here. We would assume that org mode would not be getting loaded at startup. However, let's verify that first. Let's add a message here. We say org mode loaded. Okay, so now I'm gonna exit Emacs. I'm gonna start it up one more time. And now we see that it says org mode loaded. So it's definitely getting loaded despite the fact that we have that hook expression in there. So let's move a little bit further and see what else we can see about the org configuration in this file. So we've got a lot of stuff inside of the org use package org expression. We're gonna skip a lot of this stuff here because none of this really matters. It's inside of that same expression. Okay, so we're back to the beginning of the use package org. Now we have org bullets, and that's already being set to be loaded after org, so that's not really a problem. We also have it set to hook only whenever the org mode buffer occurs. So that basically means we can just remove this after because we don't even need it here. So I'll just take that right out. Also, centering org buffers. We're using visual fill column for that. We're also hooking onto the org mode hook, so we don't need to do anything here. That will be loaded later. All right, so now we have a raw bit of Emacs Lisp here that is calling org babel do load languages. And this is not checking to see if the org package is loaded first. This may be the cause of org mode being loaded early. So this is the point where we want to talk about the with eval after load macro. Basically, this is a macro that allows you to wrap a bit of code to say, I want to run this code, but only after a particular package gets loaded. So in this case, we can basically wrap that whole block of code with eval after load, and then that will only be run after the org package gets loaded. So maybe this will help us with our startup time issue. So I'm going to indent this a little bit, make this one whole expression, and let's see if there's anything else that we might need to do the same thing with. Here we're also requiring org tempo and setting up a structure template alias. So I think that we want to do that here too, because we're requiring another package that requires org. So we definitely don't want to require this package until after org is already loaded. So just to reiterate, this is deferring this block of code until the org package gets loaded. So what gets put inside of this block is not going to be run yet. This is something that's actually built into Emacs, and it's the same thing I think that that use package is using under the covers to do the config blocks. The config blocks will say whenever this particular package name gets loaded, then run this code. So with eval after load is sort of like the thing that you would use in Emacs by default to achieve the same behavior without having to use package if you wanted to do it completely by yourself. And we have something for auto tangling configuration files. This is setting up a hook. Probably we don't need to worry about that because the org mode hook is defined as a variable with def var. And I think that, let me double check that. I think that if we set the value of that before, okay, this def custom is fine. If we set that before the package gets loaded, it doesn't load the package. It basically just adds it to the variable, and then that gets used later when the package does get loaded. We can run it now to see and just double check if I'm right about that. All right, let's restart Emacs and see what happens. Let's see what else we got here. Okay. So Emacs loaded in 5.25 seconds. I think that's an improvement. We keep seeming to have increases in time. I think it's just because I'm streaming at the same time, but hopefully we're gonna see it go down in a moment. So let's double check our messages buffer and see when org got loaded. Okay, so we can definitely see that org mode has not been loaded yet. And that's because we set up our configuration file to load org mode at the right time. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna open our Emacs configuration file, emacs.org, and see if org gets loaded then. So I'm gonna use my key binding control space FDE. And now we see the message in the message buffer that org mode got loaded. So we've been able to defer the loading of org mode until an org mode file got ran. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that maybe there's a reason why you need to have org mode loaded before an org mode file ever gets opened. Like for instance, if you use org capture templates, you may need to set up a commands list for org capture. So, let's just go ahead and do that really quick, just in case. So package org, you can say commands. We'll do org capture and org agenda, because those are usually the ones that you want to have delay the loading or make it load. Miljan C asks, is message expensive? I don't know how. I mean, if you're writing a bunch of messages, yeah, it could definitely slow things down, but I don't think it's really that slow. So just writing one message is probably not going to hurt it too much. Obviously, we can take those out to see if it is causing a little bit of extra delay. I'd be very surprised if it's adding half a second to the whole process. All right, so let's go back down where we were. Let's see, I think it was the tangle hook that the last thing we did. Okay, so it definitely doesn't cause, this part does not cause org mode to be loaded. We saw that for sure, so we'll just skip on without that. Yes, Matthew says I should use package verbose if I'm annoyed adding these message statements. You know what? Let's just go and add that and see how it looks, because maybe we can just skip you adding more messages. So in use package setup, we're going to go here and add, this is a thing you would only add temporarily just for diagnosing things. So use package verbose t. And now in future invocations of Emacs, we should see the output of that. So actually, let's look at it right now to see how much extra time it adds, because it's going to write out a lot of information, I think. It's telling us all the packages that it's loading, basically. Okay, 5.04 seconds. Surprisingly, it's actually shorter than what it was before we added that, which just shows you how, variable the load time can be. If we look at messages, it's going to tell us a lot of things here. It's going to tell us which packages it's loading. So it loaded no littering, Eval, general. It tells us when it runs the configuration section for a particular package. So it configures general now. Interesting. Okay, so it tells us when it's done finally loading general. It tells us when it's done loading Eval. It tells us how long it took to load Eval, which is nice. So that can tell you basically which packages are taking more time. So let's see. Then other packages, console apparently takes 0.2 seconds to load. So yeah, this is very useful information for this whole process. So we're going to use this going forward. All right, so let me check for Tangle one more time. Let's jump to something a little bit more interesting. Okay, so now we're down to Lsp mode. I think that our Lsp mode setup probably has most of what it needs to be faster already, so we may not need to do a whole lot of work here. So we see that we have commands set up so that we are, whoops, I deleted that. That we are waiting until we see Lsp or Lsp deferred to be run before we load this package. We also have a hook set up for Lsp mode to run our Lsp mode setup. It doesn't really matter in this case because usually we're running Lsp directly, or one of the packages that we load is causing Lsp mode to be loaded. So this part is only used for invoking this configuration function that does some extra setup anytime an Lsp mode buffer is opened. So yeah, that's basically it for that one. And then Lsp UI has a hook so that it only gets loaded whenever Lsp mode gets started. So that one's fine. Lsp Tremax, we're telling it to load after Lsp, so that's not going to get loaded at the startup, which is good. And Lsp Ivy. So right now, Lsp Ivy, we are not doing anything here to prevent that from being loaded. I think what we want to do is use after Lsp. I think that's right? Do we use package Lsp or Lsp mode? Let's use Lsp mode. I wonder if those are correct. So let's look at the messages buffer to see what it tells us about Lsp dash something. Okay, so it actually is loading Lsp Ivy, and it causes Lsp mode to get loaded. So that's not a good thing. Let's try that now. And Lsp Tremax did not get loaded, so we can tell for sure that that's not the case. Now, we're going to use after Lsp for Lsp Ivy. That will probably save us some time because we're not going to load Lsp mode anymore. Lsp mode has a lot of code in it, so definitely don't want to load that if we don't have to. Let's try that out now and see how it goes. Thanks, Joel. He says, just wanted to say there are only a few good videos about Emacs on YouTube, and they're all yours. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for saying that, and thanks for watching. Okay, so it says 5.22 seconds, which is interesting. Let's see if anything else is causing Lsp mode to get loaded. Yeah, something is causing Lsp mode to be loaded. Configuring Lsp mode, which key? Lsp mode, DAP mode. Okay, so it's probably DAP mode, which is the next one on our list. So DAP mode is also pretty big, so we definitely need to make sure that we are not going to load this until necessary. So I am going to use, let's use after Lsp here, because I don't think we care about this until Lsp mode is run. Actually, let's use a command because we don't need this until we actually want to debug something. So let's not even get the hit of loading this until we absolutely need it. So what I'm going to do is use commands, and I believe it is DAP debug. Let's see, what is it? DAP debug. Yeah, just DAP debug. I think that's the only one we need. So when DAP debug gets invoked, then we're going to load the DAP mode package. Let's see how much just that by itself helps us with. All right, so it loaded in 5 seconds, which seems to be an improvement. Let's see if Lsp mode gets loaded. Nope, no more Lsp mode, no more DAP mode. So that definitely has helped. All right, so let's see what else we can do here. I think there's another package after that is going to be pretty fruitful for delaying. All right, so Typescript mode here. we are setting it to only be loaded for .ts files. And this is kind of a weird looking syntax for this, but basically just copy the same string and just put whatever extension you want inside of it and leave the slashes and the single quote the way they are. And that should work in most cases. We are also setting up Lsp Mode to be run whenever Typescript Mode is run, but that's not going to defer this package. The mode thing is what's going to do it in this case. Python, we are setting a hook for Python mode for Lsp deferred. I think, let's see, does Python mode get loaded? Okay, Python mode is not being loaded. However, PyEnv is being loaded. I did see that in the messages, so we can definitely defer that. So let's just say put this after Python mode so we don't get that loaded until later. Company mode is being hooked to Lsp mode and even is being said to load after Lsp mode, so that one is pretty safe at the moment. Company box is also being hooked to company mode. Projectile. So projectile, I think, yeah, it's bound to a key map. Let's see if it gets loaded. Yeah, so council projectile gets loaded, which is causing projectile to be loaded. So let's definitely put this after projectile and see if that helps. All right. And all right, so let's see if we've gotten any gains from this so far. So now we're going to start over from scratch. And tells us that our load time is now 4.55 seconds. So we're definitely getting better here. It's not perfect yet, but it's a lot better. Now, I see that there are a couple packages here that add about a second and maybe almost a second and a half to the load time. Maybe we can make those not load. I think those are going to be very useful to defer until later. So it's the Magit package. As you notice, I'm pronouncing it correctly now. The Magit package, not maggot, it's Magit, as people have told me repeatedly. We are going to make this package load only when we call Magit status. So commands Magit status. So you may want to add other commands here if you have a different entry point into the Magit package. For me, I use Magit status repeatedly all day long, so this is the one that I would first call before any other Magit command. So definitely add more commands here if you use something else, like let's say Magit buffer something, I don't know, like whatever commands you might use first whenever you have an Emacs session. You'll find out pretty fast whenever you try to load one and it gives you an error that it doesn't exist. Forge, we also want to make sure that we load that after Magit, because Forge hooks its behavior into Magit, and it's not a standalone package, so it needs Magit. It needs Magit status for the core of its behavior. There's other commands that you can run that could be useful, but probably you're gonna use it in conjunction with Magit. So we're just gonna put it after Magit here. All right, so let's see how much this improved our startup time. So we're gonna run Emacs one more time if it will pop up the app launcher. And this time, our startup time is 3.55 seconds, so that's a lot better. And if I wasn't running this on a VM while I'm streaming at the same time, it would probably be more like 1.5 seconds. So it's actually a major improvement whenever you're doing this on your own machine with the same configuration. So let's see what else we have here. So let's look for Forge. And what else we have after? So the Evil Nerd commenter, we had that set up on a binding, so that's fine. Rainbow delimiters is bound to prog mode. Terminal configuration. Yeah, we could set this up. Well, okay, so term actually is part of Emacs. Does this? Yeah, so we are loading term. We don't need to load that yet. So we can say commands term here, I think, to make that stop. And eterm 256 color is being hooked on term mode. That's fine. vterm is being hooked on the vterm command, which is great. Osloy says, it's not like maggot. I would think that it's ma from Emacs and git from git. Yeah, someone told me that in an earlier stream, and I've been saying that for a long time, and then I got corrected by Jonas Bernoulli, basically to say, no, that's not right. So yeah, it's definitely maggot. I think you can say magit also, but don't say maggot because it just sounds disgusting. All right, so shell mode, let's see. Yeah, we don't need to do anything here. eShell. So eShell is definitely pretty heavy, but so we have a hook here for eShell first time mode. Are we actually loading eShell in the messages? eShell get prompt. Yeah, we needed to make that one not load up. So eShell get prompt, we're gonna put this after eShell and see if that gets any better. What else actually shows up here? The DIRED packages. We don't need some of these until we actually launch DIRED. So I am going to, well, this use package actually does set the commands for DIRED and DIRED jump. However, DIRED single is not being loaded after DIRED, so that needs to be fixed. All the icons DIRED gets hooked on DIRED mode. DIRED open also needs to be put after DIRED. Okay. And then hide dot files gets hooked to DIRED mode, which is fine. And that's it. I think that's everything in the file. So let's start up one more time and see if we clean things up a lot. All right, so 3.27 seconds it seems to be now based on what flew by. What is that? eShell get prompt, unrecognized keyword, eShell. Oh, maybe I actually put a syntax error in here. So let me check this. Get prompt. Yes, I did put one. So after eShell, let's see if the config actually needs to do more things now. Yes, like Matthew says, magic like magic. That's basically the way to think about it. All right, so we're gonna look at, whoops, wrong window. We're gonna look at messages one more time, and we're still getting some loads from Ivy Prescient, interestingly. And DIRED single, DIRED open. I don't know why those are loading. Let's see. There's not really a good way to tell why they get invoked, I think. So DIRED's, whoops. You know, it could just be that, DIRED is already loaded whenever Emacs starts up, maybe, I don't know. So we need to use commands so that they don't load up until after that. So let's actually just add the commands for how we get into DIRED in both of these and see if that actually helps. And then let's see, what else do we have here? Yeah, I think everything else is good. I think we could also hook to DIRED mode too, so. In fact, why don't we just do that? Oh, no. Let's leave it as is. Let's start over one more time and see what it does. Marson says daemon mode should be discussed today. We've actually discussed daemon mode in another video. I think it's called Unlock the Power of the Daemon with Emacs Client. So we have a video on that for improving startup time in that way. So yeah, I think that, whoops, let's go to messages really quickly. So yeah, configuring package DIRED done. I think we're okay. So it's really just, oh, Ivy Rich got loaded? Well, that's weird. I wonder if I need to, This actually exists? Okay, it exists. Ivy Rich. Anyway, some of these packages are so small that we don't really care too much about it. But what we do know is that the most recent load time that we saw was 3.29 seconds, and that's down from 5 seconds. So we've got about 2.5 seconds of improvement on startup time. If you have a lot more packages in your configuration, you'll get a lot more benefit from doing this whenever you go through all of your packages and just see which ones are being loaded and try to make it so that they don't load immediately if they don't need to load immediately. And that's going to improve your startup time a whole lot. Now, the last thing we want to cover is messing with the garbage collector so that we can make it so that the garbage collector doesn't run so many times when Emacs starts up. And the reason why this matters is Emacs Lisp is a garbage collected language. And what that means is for anything that happens in Emacs Lisp that causes memory to be allocated in your computer, whenever the code executes and then maybe finishes executing in certain parts, the Emacs Lisp system will try to clean up any old allocated memory as it goes, but it uses some variables to control when it decides to start doing that cleanup process. And what we want to do is make it so that it does that cleanup less often during startup, so that we don't have to have that cleanup process continually happening while we're loading our packages. We want to make it happen less. So there are a couple of variables we can set for that, and there's also a package we can look at really quickly. Not exactly sure how long I've been recording this particular part, but we'll see how long this video goes. It's gonna be a long video about Emacs performance, unfortunately. All right, so let me just grab this out of my own configuration really quickly, pull up my startup performance section, and really all we gotta do is set this GC cons threshold. I'm sure other people have their own magic numbers for this, but we're gonna use this one for now. And first, what we're gonna do is we're gonna make sure we keep an eye on the number of garbage collections that have been done right now before we go and change this. So let's check messages. All right, this says it did 23 garbage collections. Now what we're doing is setting GC const threshold to a high number. So currently the value for this is, let's see, is that 800,000. So we're gonna set this instead to about, I don't know, was that 5 billion? No, 50 million, 50 million. All right, so we're gonna see how many garbage collections happen during startup now. So keep in mind, it was 23 before, and now let's see what it is after we set that value. All right, so now let's go look at our messages. Okay, so now Emacs loaded in 2.73 seconds with 4 garbage collections. So obviously that made a huge difference. That's about another second shaved off, more or less. And there's only 4 garbage collections. Now, what we've done is set that value really high, and as you continue using Emacs, it's gonna make your Emacs process just explode with the amount of memory that it uses. So we need to set that value back to what it was before whenever we get to the end of our load of our configuration. Let me actually see what I do for that. So I'm basically setting it back lower at the end. I'm just gonna copy this whole section here. And there's another trick you can use for this, which I'll talk about in just one second, but let's just add this really quickly. So I will go down to the bottom of the file here. I'm just gonna put in this runtime performance section, and this is just gonna put GC const threshold way back down to 2 megabytes instead of 50 megabytes. I think that's what it was. All right, so now let's just start Emacs back up one more time and see what it does. All right, so did it load everything? Okay, that was pretty fast. Okay, it's 2.68 sections with 5 garbage collections, and now we've got our GC const threshold back to 2 megabytes. Okay, so honestly, it's good to have this value set a little bit higher so that your Emacs performance is better in day-to-day usage. This original value is kind of low by default, so you kind of don't want to use the default value for that. So this is a good thing to do anyway, because it's going to make Emacs feel a little bit more snappy, and you're going to have less pauses whenever you're doing things like switching buffers and running commands, etc. So all in all these configuration changes will make your Emacs start up a lot faster and feel faster to use. Now, there's one last thing that I wanted to cover, which is a package which is created by, let's see if I can get their name right. I think that's the right name. Emacs GC. I may not. Okay, that's the website. So there's a person who is very good at tweaking Emacs performance. And if you've ever heard of the new work to make Emacs Lisp code be dynamically compiled to native code at runtime, it is being done by this person, Andrea Corallo. I think that this is their name. Yeah, Andrea Corallo. So there's another package they did, I think back in 2019, which is actually a garbage collection magic hack. I have not used this before, but other people have told me they use it, and it actually could be useful for this. And not only does it set the garbage collection to a better thing during startup, I think it does something at runtime too, where it's constantly tweaking that garbage collector and making it so that you don't have to do as much to set it. So let me actually look at what it's doing really quick. So we're starting a minor mode called GCMH mode. Let me increase the size of this a little bit. And yeah, pre-command hook, post-command hook. So basically, anytime a command gets running Emacs, he's setting the threshold for the GC to be high, and then back to a lower value after the command finishes. So basically, anytime a command is running, it's making it so the GC has a lot more memory to work with, and then after, when it's idle, it goes back to a lower value, so then the GC will start cleaning up whenever Emacs is idle. And let's see, does this do anything at startup? Yeah, I'm not sure if it does anything at startup. So it may be used in addition. Anybody who's used this before, definitely feel free to say something in chat about it. But this is definitely something to try out. I'm not going to run it today, but it's definitely something for you to keep in mind if you want to continue your work on tweaking your startup performance. I'm just going to put a link here so I can keep it for later. So anyway, that's all there is for that topic today. Basically, we have been able to take our startup time on the Emacs from Scratch config from 5 seconds down to about 2.5 to 3 seconds, which is a big improvement. It's basically cutting it in half. So hopefully this is a good inspiration for you to go and to speed up your own configuration to make it work better. I'm going to check in these changes to the Emacs From Scratch repo after this video is complete, and then you should be able to pull those down and use them and try them out and tweak them yourself and do all that. I'll also check in this file to the show notes whenever the stream is done. Oh yes, thank you, Matthew. One last thing that he wanted to remind me of is the use package always defer variable. I'm just going to discuss it really quickly. Use package, actually let's pull it back into this window so it's easier to see. So use package always defer. So if you set this to true, basically it's going to defer all of your packages by default, which is useful for making sure things are fast. And then the ones you absolutely want to make sure get loaded, you want to use demand T on those. And this could actually be easier than the process we just went through because we don't have to do trial and error. In fact, why don't we just try it really quickly and see what it does with all of the packages. There's a chance it could break some things, but we'll find out. We'll see what happens. So we're going to put this right here. Set queue, use package always defer T. All right, so let's start over Emacs one more time. All right, let's see what happens. Okay, so already we've got a problem because general.el did not get loaded. So this is exactly the point I was trying to make. If you always defer, you're going to have to go and manually say which packages you want to demand. However, this is probably a safer approach just because you're able to be very clear about which ones you want to load by default. So we're not going to go through and set all those up because it's going to be another 15-minute ordeal. So just go and try that out too if you want to have another way to do this that's a little bit more reliable. Thanks for reminding me about that, Matthew. All right, so that concludes this episode on increasing Emacs startup time. Hopefully that was helpful to you. The people who are here on the live stream, stick around because we're not going to be finished with the live stream yet. But those of you who are watching the recording after the fact, thanks a lot for watching. And I will do the sponsor screen right after this. But for now, I'm just going to say until next time, happy hacking. Thanks a lot for watching. Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed that little experiment in content creation. So before I go, I would love to thank my sponsors. These people have decided to sponsor the work that I do, creating these videos on Emacs and Linux, etc. And I'm very thankful for their help and their sponsorship. It's very inspiring to me for people to be really enthusiastic and want to help. So if you're interested in becoming a sponsor for the channel, definitely check out the 2 links I have below in the description. I'm on both GitHub sponsors and Patreon. And there's also a link to PayPal in case you want to do like a one-time donation. Anything that you would like to do is great. So next time, I think that we're going to talk about... Well, I'm not sure what we're going to talk about because we'll have to think about some more videos to do for the Emacs From Scratch series. So if you are interested in seeing more in the Emacs From Scratch series, please let me know some ideas in the comments. And also be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon to be notified every time that we go live in the future. We make new videos twice a week and then a live stream on Friday. So definitely subscribe so that you're notified about those things. And as I said before, until next time, we will see you then. Happy hacking. Thanks a lot.